Jack Henry Abbott was born on January 21, 1944, on a U.S. Army base in Michigan. His father was a soldier of Irish descent, and his mother was of Chinese heritage. From birth, Abbott's life was shaped by instability and dislocation. His father abandoned the family early, and his mother was unable to care for him properly. By the age of 9, he was placed in a series of foster homes, institutions, and reformatories. This formative period was rife with neglect and abuse. Abbott's early behavior was turbulent. Teachers and caregivers reported his uncontrollable temper and defiance. He exhibited early signs of antisocial behavior, stealing, lying, and refusing to conform to societal norms. By 12, he had been placed in the Utah State Industrial School, a reform institution for juvenile offenders. The punitive methods used in these institutions, rather than rehabilitating him, further instilled in him a deep hatred for authority and the justice system. He later claimed these experiences were the root of his anger and distrust. At age 16, Abbott was already facing adult criminal charges. In 1963, at just 19, he was convicted of forging checks and sent to the Utah State Prison. There, he became involved in a violent prison culture. In 1966, during a confrontation in prison, he stabbed another inmate to death. While Abbott claimed it was self-defense, the court disagreed, and he was given a sentence of 3 to 20 years for second-degree homicide. But his criminal path did not end there. In 1971, Abbott escaped from prison and committed a bank robbery in Colorado. Captured soon afterward, he was sentenced to an additional 19 years in federal prison for armed robbery, further solidifying his lifetime trajectory of incarceration. Abbott was placed in solitary confinement for much of his time behind bars due to his repeated violations of prison rules and violent outbursts. He later wrote of spending years in isolation, sometimes locked in a cell for 23 hours a day, with only a metal bed and a hole in the floor for a toilet. It was during this time that Abbott began to read voraciously, philosophy, literature, law, and taught himself how to write. His writing, filled with rage, philosophy, and a unique style, reflected both his intellectual capabilities and psychological disturbance. In 1977, while incarcerated in a federal prison in Marion, Illinois, Abbott read about Norman Mailer, the celebrated American novelist and journalist, who was writing a book about Gary Gilmore, a death row inmate who had been executed in Utah. Abbott wrote to Mailer, asserting that he could offer first-hand insights into prison life that Gilmore, executed before his book was completed, could not provide. Mailer was immediately struck by Abbott's literary voice, raw, intelligent, and brutally honest. The two began a lengthy correspondence. These letters, filled with reflections on incarceration, state power, violence, and personal suffering, would become the basis of Abbott's first book, In the Belly of the Beast. Mailer, captivated by Abbott's intellect, believed that society had overlooked the deeper humanity and genius within inmates like him. In 1980, selections of Abbott's letters were published in the New York Review of Books, attracting attention from editors and publishers. Errol MacDonald, an editor at Random House, offered Abbott a $12,500 advance and a book deal. The resulting volume, In the Belly of the Beast, was released in 1981 with a foreword by Mailer. The book was a scathing indictment of the American penal system, at once brilliant, provocative, disturbing, and self-serving. Critics praised Abbott's language and psychological insight. Terence Desprez, writing in the New York Times Book Review, called it awesome, brilliant, perversely ingenious, an articulation of penal nightmare. Abbott, an unknown convict, became an overnight literary sensation. Abbott was still behind bars as his literary star rose. Mailer, now thoroughly convinced that Abbott had been rehabilitated through literature, threw his weight behind Abbott's parole bid. He promised the parole board that Abbott would be employed as his research assistant and that the literary community would help reintegrate him into society. Despite serious reservations from prison officials and psychiatrists who labeled Abbott a dangerous sociopath, the parole board granted him release in June 1981. Abbott was sent to a halfway house in Manhattan's East Village. There, he entered the bohemian world of writers, critics, and intellectuals. He was seen on Good Morning America, attended literary parties, and was treated as a symbol of redemption, the prisoner-turned-writer. But behind the scenes, Abbott struggled. He felt like an imposter, unable to reconcile the elite world he now inhabited with his violent past. He felt patronized, watched, and alienated. Friends reported that he became increasingly paranoid and erratic. On the night of July 17, 1981, just 6 weeks after his release, Abbott and two women visited Binibon, a small cafe in the East Village. Richard Adan, a 22-year-old aspiring actor and playwright who worked as a waiter at the restaurant, informed Abbott that the restroom was for staff only, in accordance with the establishment's policy and insurance limitations. A confrontation ensued. What should have been a minor disagreement escalated. The two men stepped outside the restaurant, and Abbott stabbed Adan in the chest with a knife, killing him almost instantly. Abbott fled the scene, disappearing before police could catch him. Tragically and ironically, the New York Times published a glowing review of In the Belly of the Beast the very next day, unaware of the murder. Abbott remained on the run for over 2 months, eventually captured in Louisiana in September 1981. In January 1982, Abbott stood trial for the murder of Richard Adan. Representing himself, he admitted to the killing but argued it was not premeditated and resulted from a tense, escalating encounter. He painted himself as a man shaped by institutional brutality, incapable of navigating normal social interactions. The jury convicted him of first-degree manslaughter, not murder, and he was sentenced to 15 years to life. The public and literary community reacted harshly. Critics and commentators questioned how Norman Mailer, Random House, and the parole board could have been so blind to Abbott's propensity for violence. Mailer, for his part, admitted that he had misjudged Abbott and said the experience left him with nothing to be proud of. "I never knew a man who had a worse life," Mailer later said, reflecting on Abbott's trajectory. Abbott's case became a symbol of the limits of rehabilitation, the naivete of literary idealism, and the failures of the parole system. Some called it a tragic mistake. Others believed Abbott was a manipulator, who used his literary talent as a weapon. In 1990, Richard Adan's widow filed a civil lawsuit against Abbott, seeking $10 million in damages. Abbott, again representing himself, conducted a cold and aggressive cross-examination, even chastising the widow for crying in court. The jury awarded $7.57 million to the family. While Abbott had already been prevented from profiting from his book under New York Son of Sam law, this lawsuit ensured he would never profit from his notoriety. This judgment also symbolized an effort to reclaim dignity for Adan, a talented playwright and actor whose promising future was tragically cut short. In 1986, Abbott released a second book titled My Return. Unlike his first work, this book was poorly received. Critics found it self-indulgent, meandering, and lacking remorse. Abbott used the book as a platform to blame society, the prison system, and the courts. He never once expressed regret for his crimes. He continued to maintain that his life had been a product of systemic oppression, a message that began to wear thin. The literary community that once praised him now mostly turned away, viewing Abbott as a cautionary tale rather than a prophet. In 2001, Abbott once again sought parole. His request was denied, citing his refusal to show remorse, disciplinary violations in prison, and his extensive history of violence. By now, his reputation had faded, and he was largely forgotten. On February 10, 2002, Jack Henry Abbott, aged 58, was found dead in his prison cell at Wendy Correctional Facility in Alden, New York. He had used a bedsheet and shoelace to hang himself. A suicide note was reportedly found, but its contents were never made public. His death led to conspiracy theories. Some in his family believed he had been murdered. However, 2 separate coroners confirmed the cause as suicide. Bruce Jackson, a scholar of prison literature who had corresponded with Abbott, reflected on the language Abbott used to avoid accountability. In court briefs, Abbott referred to Adan not by name, but as the deceased, using the passive voice to dodge personal responsibility. This insight revealed Abbott's mastery of language as a means not only to convey ideas, but to manipulate truth and avoid guilt. The story of Jack Henry Abbott is one of contradictions. He was intelligent, articulate, and capable of profound insight, yet also violent, remorseless, and manipulative. His life highlighted the failures of the criminal justice system, but also the dangers of idealizing those who speak eloquently about suffering without confronting their own moral accountability. Abbott's life intersected tragically with that of Richard Adan, a young man of great promise. Adan was not just a victim but also an artist, whose play had been recently accepted by La Mema Experimental Theatre Club in New York. Abbott stole not just a life, but a future that might have given voice to another kind of truth. Controversial. He saw in Abbott a raw and powerful talent, and believed in the transformative power of literature. But he, like many others, was perhaps blinded by his own narrative of redemption. In the end, Jack Henry Abbott's story is not simply about a killer-turned-writer, but about a society struggling to understand crime, punishment, and the fragile border between genius and madness.